649 men killed, 1,700 wounded, a casualty rate 50% higher than any other infantry battalion New Zealand ever sent to war. The 28th Māori Battalion earned a reputation few units in the Second World War could match. Feared in Crete, decisive in North Africa, unstoppable in Italy. And yet, across the thousands of Japanese diaries pulled from dead soldiers' pockets in the Pacific, not one entry describes fighting them. Not one. The battalion that broke German paratroopers with a bayonet charge never fired a single shot at the Army New Zealand was actually at war with in the Pacific. So when Japanese soldiers wrote about Maori in their diaries, and they did, who exactly were they writing about? This isn't a story about the 28th Battalion meeting Japan on some jungle island. That battle never happened, and it never could have. The battalion spent the entire war in Greece, Crete, North Africa, and Italy, thousands of miles from the Pacific front. The real story is stranger. It runs through a doomed prisoner of war camp in rural New Zealand, a beheading on a Pacific atoll, a language Axis codebreakers could never crack, and a soldier's diary pulled from a still-warm body on an island most people have never heard of. It's a story about a different Maori war, fought not by the 28th, but by the men of the 3rd New Zealand Division, coastal defense units, and camp guards who never got the legend. And it ends with a question historians still argue over. Was one of its darkest chapters a mutiny or a massacre? The confusion isn't an accident. It comes from how good the 28th Battalion actually was. By 1941, defending Crete, the battalion was already building the reputation that would follow it for the rest of the war. At the Battle of 42nd Street, facing elite German paratroopers, the Maori soldiers didn't wait in their trenches. They rose out of them, performed the haka, the paru-paru, weapons in hand, and closed the distance while the Germans stood frozen. It worked, devastatingly. And it built a legend large enough that decades later popular memory simply assumed a unit this fearsome must have fought Imperial Japan too. They didn't need to. New Zealand had other forces bound for the Pacific, and among them were plenty of Maori, just not from the 28th. To understand why any Maori went to war at all, you need one political argument made in 1939 by a Ngati Porou leader named Apirana Ngata. Ngata believed shedding blood for the empire was the only way Maori would be treated as equal citizens once the war ended. "We are of one house," he told Parliament, "and if our Pakeha brothers fall, we fall with them." Not everyone agreed. In the Waikato, under Princess Te Puea Hirangi, entire iwi refused to fight. Still furious over land the Crown had confiscated decades earlier in the New Zealand Wars. Some were arrested for resisting conscription. Even among those who enlisted, resentment lingered. When the 28th Battalion formed, command refused to give Maori officers top authority, installing a Pakeha officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Dittmer, instead. It took years of brutal fighting in North Africa and undeniable tactical brilliance before Maori officers like Charles Bennett and Pira Watere were finally trusted to lead their own men. The wider war effort split down the middle. The 28th, organized by tribal companies, sailed for the Middle East. Other Maori went to units bound for the Pacific, coastal defense, the 3rd Division, and eventually guard duty over Japanese prisoners. That second group is where the rest of this story happens. Before a single Japanese diary was ever translated, New Zealand's Pacific Intelligence Network was already being dismantled, quietly, brutally, on a scatter of coral atolls in the Gilbert Islands. In December 1941, Japan occupied Butariteri. 7 New Zealand Coastwatchers, radio operators hiding in the jungle canopy, were captured almost immediately. 10 months later on Tarawa, 17 more military personnel and 5 civilians were hunted down. They kept transmitting almost to the end, tapping out reports of Japanese fleet movements, while radio direction finders slowly closed in on their position. Then they were led to a clearing and beheaded. It was New Zealand's first real intelligence disaster of the Pacific War, and it forced Allied command toward a very different kind of source: paper. There's a small, strange coda to the Tarawa story. Because the Coastwatchers were technically civilians when they died, their widows had no legal claim to a military pension. So the New Zealand government quietly went back afterward and gave the dead men retroactive military rank, a bureaucratic fix for a debt that couldn't otherwise be paid. Here's the twist historians keep coming back to. Imperial Japanese military doctrine itself created one of the biggest intelligence leaks of the entire Pacific War. Under the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, capture was considered a fate worse than death. Soldiers were taught they would never survive to be taken prisoner. So they wrote candidly, openly, recklessly, from a security standpoint. On Guadalcanal in December 1942, American forces recovered diary after diary from Japanese dead. One soldier described hunting lice for entertainment. Another recorded on Christmas Day that his presence from the enemy that year had been intense bombardment. His pulse, he wrote, had dropped to 95. He could eat only a single measure of rice. These men weren't writing war stories. They were writing their own unit's obituaries. Starvation, collapsing morale, the growing realization that the Imperial Navy had abandoned them, and Allied translators read every word. It's why historians now rank document exploitation, DOSEX, alongside code breaking in importance. The diaries gave Allied command a real-time X-ray of Japanese collapse, and it directly shaped the decision to bypass fortified islands entirely, to let the jungle and the starvation already visible in the handwriting finish the job. Guadalcanal wasn't the only place Japanese soldiers were writing themselves into the record. In New Guinea, an infantryman named Tamura Yoshikazu kept a diary that traces one of the clearest psychological collapses of the war. Tamura had been raised on the kokutai, the ideology of the emperor and the noble death, taigi, that supposedly made a soldier's sacrifice glorious. His early entries reflect it. His later ones don't. As starvation and disease closed in, Tamura started writing poems about the moon, small, quiet attempts to think about something other than the mud and the men dying slowly around him. He never described a battle with Maori or New Zealand troops directly. He didn't need to. His diary shows exactly what the Guadalcanal diary showed: an army being defeated by its own environment before a single Allied bullet finished the job. He died in New Guinea. His diary didn't. Not every Maori intersection with this war ended in tragedy. Some of it was almost comically effective, in the way only real wartime improvisation can be. Back in Europe, the 28th Battalion had its own intelligence trick, nothing to do with Japan directly, but relevant to a pattern that keeps recurring in this story. Radio operators used Te Reo Maori for field passwords and countersigns. Axis signals intelligence had no linguistic database for Polynesian languages at all. It functioned in practice as an unbreakable organic cipher, the same principle behind the American military's use of Navajo code talkers in the Pacific, discovered independently on the other side of the world. It's a small detail in the wider record, but it points to something larger. Maori servicemen kept turning up at the exact pressure points where conventional methods weren't working and improvising something that did. The same instinct shows up in how the battalion trained. Recruits practiced bayonet drills using the taiaha, the traditional Maori fighting staff, adapting centuries-old parry and thrust techniques to a modern rifle. Old knowledge, repurposed for a new weapon. It's the same pattern as the Tereo radio code. Nothing borrowed from a manual. Everything drawn from what the soldiers already carried with them. The clearest example of a captured diary changing outcomes on the ground happened almost a year after Guadalcanal, on a small island called Mono in the Treasury Group. On 27 October 1943, the New Zealand 8th Brigade launched the country's first opposed amphibious landing since Gallipoli. Days later, on 8 November, a patrol ambushed 12 remaining Japanese defenders in the jungle. Among the New Zealanders searching the bodies afterward was Private Kenneth Mayne, a civilian volunteer from Thames who'd left his family behind to serve with the 36th Battalion. In the pocket of one dead soldier, Mayne found a diary. He didn't keep it as a souvenir, which is what plenty of frontline troops did with items like this. He handed it over. American interpreter Harry Shinto helped translate it, and the entries described, in the enemy's own hand, the terror of the New Zealand naval bombardment that had hit the island days earlier, and the defensive plans the survivors had scraped together in its aftermath. That notebook still sits in the Alexander Turnbull Library today. A single soldier's private fear, recovered from his body, turned into tactical intelligence within days. Diaries recovered from the dead were one thing. Living prisoners were something else entirely. And this is where the intelligence operation came closest to catastrophe. By September 1942, American forces on Guadalcanal had more Japanese prisoners than they had anywhere secure to hold them, and no spare infrastructure in the middle of an active campaign to build a camp from scratch. New Zealand agreed to take them, repurposing a leftover First World War training ground near the small Wairarapa town of Featherston. The plan had one fatal, invisible flaw. New Zealand assumed Japan honored the 1929 Geneva Convention's rule allowing prisoner labor. But Japan had signed that convention in 1929 and never ratified it. To the Japanese prisoners at Featherston, being ordered to work for the enemy wasn't a routine POW obligation. Under the Senjin-kun, it was an unbearable compounding of the shame they already carried simply for being alive and captured. Among them was a young naval officer named Michiharu Shinya, who later wrote a memoir describing the camp's commandant, Donald Donaldson, in blunt terms. A lean figure and a man of few words and chilly manner. Correct by regulation. Completely unequipped for what he was actually managing. By February 1943, tension inside the camp had been building for months, not primarily between guards and prisoners, but among the prisoners themselves. The camp population had split into two factions: older conscripted laborers resigned to captivity, and younger combat veterans who viewed any cooperation as unforgivable. The militants bullied the moderates into line, enforcing a unified refusal to work. On the morning of 25th of February, Sub-Lieutenant Toshio Adachi led 240 men in a sit-down strike. Donaldson refused to negotiate. When guards moved to arrest Adachi, he fell back into the crowd. The camp adjutant, James Malcolm, fired 2 warning shots. One ricocheted and struck Adachi. That was the spark. The prisoners surged forward with stones and whatever they could grab. The guards, most with little to no combat experience, some of them Maori servicemen assigned to camp duty, were badly outnumbered and had received no order to open fire. They fired anyway. It lasted 30 seconds. When it stopped, 48 Japanese prisoners were dead, along with 1 New Zealand guard, killed by a stray round in the chaos. A military court of inquiry later exonerated the guards, ruling they'd acted in self-defense against a riotous mob. Japan's government rejected that finding outright and used the incident to help justify its own brutal treatment of Allied prisoners across Asia, complicating war crimes tribunals for years afterward. Historians still argue over what to call it. A mutiny in the sense that it began as organized defiance, or a massacre, given how disproportionate the response was to 240 unarmed men sitting on the ground? Both readings are defensible. Neither fully explains it because neither side was working from the same understanding of what was actually at stake. Here's the detail that rarely makes it into the official record. Some historians believe several of the militant prisoners at Featherston weren't trying to escape or even to win the confrontation. They were trying to die. Under the Senjin-kun, capture itself was a disgrace severe enough that some Japanese POWs gave interrogators false names, erasing themselves from their own family's history rather than let their real names carry the shame of surrender. If you accept that reading, the Featherston strike wasn't a prison riot at all. It was 240 men engineering their own execution because dying in custody was less unbearable than living with what capture already meant. Nobody at Featherston had the cultural framework to see that coming. And that, more than any single decision Donaldson made, is the actual failure underneath the tragedy. The strangest reversal in this story didn't happen during the war. It happened afterward, once the fighting was already over. In March 1946, D Squadron of the New Zealand Divisional Cavalry arrived in Yamaguchi Prefecture as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, J-Force. The squadron was entirely Maori, many of them reinforcements originally destined for the 28th Battalion. Japanese civilians, primed by years of propaganda, expected looting and retribution. What they got instead was Maori soldiers sharing rations, hosting Christmas parties for orphaned Japanese children, and being photographed handing coins to a blind street musician in Tokyo. In Hiroshima, J-Force personnel accepted a turtle as a gift from local children and used the goodwill it built to help locate hidden radar stations the Japanese military had left behind. Men who'd been trained, feared, and mythologized as an enemy's worst nightmare spent their next deployment throwing birthday parties for the children of the country that had once feared them. Not every unresolved question in this story involves Japan directly. One of the deepest wounds sits entirely within the British command structure. At the Battle of Takruna in North Africa, Sergeant Heini Manahi led an assault against roughly 300 Axis troops. 3 separate generals recommended him for the Victoria Cross. London downgraded it to a Distinguished Conduct Medal instead. No official explanation was ever given. For decades, Maori veterans and their families believed the reason was obvious: institutional racism inside the British High Command, quietly correcting a Maori soldier out of the Empire's highest honor. It took until 2007 for the Crown to formally acknowledge the injustice to Manahi's tribe, 64 years after the battle that should have earned it. There's one more misconception worth clearing up because it shapes how this whole story tends to get told. Allied wartime propaganda loved painting Maori soldiers through the noble savage trope, all bayonet charges and haka, primal aggression packaged as entertainment for the home front. Modern military historians push back hard on that framing. The 28th Battalion's actual record shows disciplined modern combined arms infantry, soldiers who mastered artillery coordination, logistics, and tactics as thoroughly as any unit in the New Zealand Army. The haka wasn't the whole story. It was one weapon in a much larger, more professional arsenal, and reducing it to spectacle erases most of what actually made the battalion effective. Even the battalion's marching song carries a quieter version of the same improvisational instinct running through this whole story. Maori words set to a borrowed American university tune, repurposed into something entirely their own. Put all of it together, And the picture that emerges is almost the opposite of the myth this video started with. The 28th Battalion never needed to fight Japan to become legendary. Crete in North Africa did that on their own. The actual documented collision between Japanese soldiers and Maori happened somewhere. The popular story never looks. In the diaries of starving men on Guadalcanal, in a translated notebook from a corpse on Mono Island, in a paddock outside Featherston where two warrior codes destroyed each other in 30 seconds, and in a POW memorial that now carries a Japanese haiku about summer grass and the dreams of dead soldiers. None of it required the 28th Battalion to have been there. It only required New Zealand's other Maori servicemen, the ones history remembers less, to have been exactly where the war actually put them. So go back to the number this video opened with: 649 dead, 1,700 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any New Zealand infantry battalion in the war, earned entirely in Europe and North Africa, against an enemy that was never Japan. The Japanese soldiers who wrote about Maori in their diaries were never describing a battle with that battalion. They were describing Coastwatchers who kept transmitting until they were beheaded, a private who chose to save a dead man's diary instead of pocketing it as a trophy. Guards, some of the Maori, who fired for 30 seconds and spent the rest of their lives being asked whether that was self-defense or slaughter. And in the one place where the myth and the reality finally do overlap, Yamaguchi Prefecture, 1946, the record shows something almost nobody expects. Soldiers once feared as an unstoppable enemy spent their occupation of Japan giving toys to children whose fathers they had never actually fought. Today, a memorial at the site of the old Featherston camp carries a classical Japanese verse about summer grass growing over the forgotten dreams of soldiers, placed there long after the guns went quiet. For men who never got the war, this video's title promised. They got a different one instead, quieter, less remembered, and just as real.